Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tumbling down the rabbit hole of dream philosophy.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah, you, our inquisitive listener, actually sparked this. You asked, why do we dream and, what's the big picture?
Right, those fundamental questions.
Exactly. So we've gathered some fascinating material excerpts from a text called Filosofía del Sueño, ¿Por qué sonamos? To try and get some answers.
Yeah, our mission really is to unpack the core philosophical puzzles around dreaming. We'll explore different angles, aiming for those light bulb moments.
Without getting too tangled in, overly complex theories.
Hopefully. We want to make it accessible.
Okay, let's kick things off with the big one. How can I be sure that I am not always dreaming?
The classic.
Our source, drawing on Owen Flanagan, flags this as the first major philosophical question. It lands squarely in the realm of epistemology, right? The study of knowledge itself.
Precisely. Then, secondly, we have an ethical quandary. Can I be immoral in dreams?
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, this pushes us to think about right and wrong, even in that, seemingly lawless landscape of our sleeping minds.
The third question plunges us into the philosophy of mind. Are dreams conscious experiences that happen during sleep?
This is a real head-scratcher. And we'll uncover some pretty surprising perspectives on it later on.
I bet. And finally, from the philosophy of biology, does dreaming have an evolutionary function?
Why did nature, equip us with this nightly spectacle? What's it for?
But hold on, there's more. Our source also highlights a couple of modern philosophical questions we'll be dipping our toes into.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
First, is dreaming an ideal scientific model for studying consciousness?
Okay. Interesting angle.
And the second intriguing question is dreaming hallucination or imagination?
Right. What is that subjective experience actually like? Is it seeing things that aren't there or just thinking in pictures?
Exactly. So let's dive into that classic epistemological brain teaser. How can I be sure that I am not always dreaming?
Okay. This leads us straight to Descartes and his famous dream argument.
Great.
In his search for absolute certainty, Descartes, initially took it for granted that he was sitting by the fire, writing.
Seems reasonable enough.
Well, yeah, but then he thought about his past dreams where he felt just as certain about things that turned out to be false.
Oh, okay. Like dreaming he was sitting by the fire.
Exactly. He'd been utterly convinced in a dream, only to wake up and realize, nope, just a dream. This led him to that central, really unsettling question. How do I know that I am not dreaming right now?
It's a powerful thought experiment.
It really is. And while Descartes wasn't the absolute first to ponder this, thinkers like Zhuangzi, Plato, Aristotle touched on similar ideas, he was the first philosopher to really wrestle with it systematically, try to nail down an answer.
And the implications are huge, aren't they?
Absolutely. Crucially, the deceptive nature of dreams led him to doubt the reliability of our senses, even when we think we're awake. At least that was his starting point, before he brought in his idea of a benevolent God later on.
So the dream experience itself becomes this key piece of evidence for skepticism.
Exactly. Evidence for the ultimate skeptical idea that everything we believe to be true could be false, just products of a dream.
Wow.
And Descartes, according to our source, held what's often called the received view of dreaming. Basically, that a dream is a sequence of experiences, often mirroring waking life, but crucially, you don't realize you're dreaming while it's happening.
Right, you're just in it.
You're just in it.
Yeah.
And Descartes highlighted the unsettling possibility that a dream could be totally indistinguishable from waking life. Any apparent subjective differences we might think exist aren't enough to give us absolute certainty.
So you can't just pinch yourself and know for sure.
Not according to Descartes. He even questioned the reality of the objects around him. Were they genuine or just, dream props? This dream scenario wasn't just a fleeting thought for him. It was the initial spark for his whole method of doubt.
Where he questions everything.
Everything he thought he knew. Yeah.
So the argument really boils down to, we can't rule out being deceived.
Right. We can't rule out the possibility that we're dreaming right now, or later in his philosophy, that an evil demon is tricking us. And because we can't rule it out, we lack absolute certainty about our present state.
It's fascinating how the dream argument sort of sets the stage for the evil demon argument.
It really does. It lays the groundwork for that broader skepticism.
Okay, so Descartes throws down this massive challenge. How did other philosophers respond? Did they just accept it?
Oh, definitely not. Our source delves into some key objections. One major point of contention was Descartes' assertion that there are no definitive markers, no foolproof signs to distinguish waking from dreaming.
Right, because that's key to his whole argument.
Exactly. So you get people like Thomas Hobbes who argued that, well, waking life just isn't usually as absurd as dreams are.
Yeah, that seems fair. Dreams can be pretty bizarre.
Right. Hobbes pointed to the general lack of absurdity in waking life as a key difference. You don't typically find yourself flying or having tea with historical figures when you're awake, usually.
Usually.
Yeah.
Then there was Locke, right? He had a different angle.
Yeah, John Locke brought in the experience of pain. He famously asked us to consider the difference between dreaming of being in a fire and actually being in a fire.
Ouch. Yeah, that sounds different.
Locke's point was that can't feel real, intense physical pain in dreams the way we do when we're awake. So for Locke, that intense pain is a pretty reliable sign you're awake.
Okay, so if I stub my toe really hard, I can be pretty sure I'm not dreaming.
That's Locke's idea, basically. If I'm burning, I'll know it. But Descartes had a counter, didn't he?
He did. Descartes believed dreams are multiform, meaning they can realistically replicate any possible waking experience.
So even intense pain.
In principle, yes. According to Descartes, there's no experience in waking life that couldn't be perfectly simulated in a dream, making it feel utterly real.
And what does the science say? Can we feel pain in dreams?
Well, our source points to some empirical studies. It seems localized pain can occur in dreams. Things like being pricked or maybe a dull ache, though it seems to be pretty rare.
So maybe not the raging fire example, but some pain is possible.
Right. The question of intensely agonizing continuous pain, like Locke's fire example, seems more open. But the general trend in research actually seems to lean towards corroborating Descartes' view that dreams can mimic pretty much any waking state, which really blows those lines Locke and Hobbes tried to draw.
It does. So if absurdity and pain aren't foolproof markers, what else is there?
Well, another idea is the principle of coherence, suggested by Norman Malcolm later on.
Coherence, how does that work?
The idea is that we can tell we're awake because our current experiences connect logically to the overall narrative of our lives. Waking life has this consistent thread.
Okay. So I know I'm awake now because I remember waking up, having breakfast, coming here. It all fits together.
Exactly. Whereas in a dream, you might suddenly be somewhere completely different or talking to someone who's been dead for years with no logical transition.
That makes sense. Dreams often lack that continuity.
But our source points out, it still seems possible to have dreams that do connect to the general course of our lives, or at least seem to while you're in them. So maybe coherence isn't an absolute guarantee either.
So we're kind of back where we started, no certain way to know.
The general consensus among philosophers seems to be that, yeah, there's no foolproof, 100% certain way to distinguish dreaming from waking based on subjective experience alone. Whether that actually undermines all our knowledge is, well, still hotly debated.
Okay, so if we can't be absolutely certain we're not dreaming, how do philosophers try to sort of get around this skeptical challenge? Is there another way out?
Well, Ernest Sosa offers an interesting alternative perspective. He suggests that when dreaming, we do not really believe, we only imagine.
Imagine, so not actual belief.
Right. His argument is that dreams are essentially elaborate imagined scenarios. We don't genuinely believe we're flying or fighting monsters. We're just imagining it very vividly.
Okay, so if it's just imagination, it doesn't carry the same, epistemic weight. It can't undermine our real waking beliefs.
That's Sosa's line of thought. If dreaming is just make-believe, it can't deceive us in the way Descartes worried about.
That's clever. But does everyone agree with that?
Not entirely. Jonathan Ichikawa, for instance, agrees with Sosa that dreams probably involve imagination more than belief. But he disagrees that this solves the skeptical problem.
Why not?
Because, Ichikawa argues, even if they're just imagined scenarios, the subjective experience of a dream can still be indistinguishable from a waking experience.
Oh, so it feels the same, whether it's belief or imagination.
Exactly. And because the experiences feel the same, Ichikawa thinks it would be epistemically irresponsible to just assume our waking experiences are genuine beliefs simply because we label our dreams as imagination. The fundamental uncertainty remains. So the worry persists. Is this waking feeling really a belief? Or is it just a very convincing imagination happening within a dream I don't realize I'm having?
Precisely. It brings the doubt right back.
Wow, okay. That really sets up the depth of the problem. Moving on from whether we can be sure we're awake, let's dive into the ethics of dreaming.
Right. Shifting from knowledge to morality.
This takes a turn, focusing on questions of right and wrong within the dream world. And the surprising takeaway seems to be that maybe our dreams aren't the consequence-free zones we often assume them to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. The ethical discussion around sleep nowadays often focuses on sleepwalking real-world harm caused by someone who isn't fully conscious. Legal systems grapple with that.
Right, practical consequences.
But philosophers, as our source points out, are often more interested in the phenomenology of ordinary dreams. Does it even make sense to apply notions of right and wrong to what happens when we're dreaming?
And that leads us straight to St. Augustine, doesn't it?
It does. He was apparently deeply concerned by some of his own dreams, particularly sexual dreams that conflicted with his waking commitment to celibacy.
That must have been quite troubling for him, trying to live this morally upright life.
You can imagine. In his confessions, he asks this really poignant question: am I not myself during sleep? He felt like he was the person in his dreams performing these actions that disturbed him.
So how did he deal with that?
He came up with a key distinction between happenings and actions.
Okay, what's the difference there?
He argued that dreams fall into the category of happenings. They're experiences that occur to us without our conscious choice or agency, like something washing over you.
Ah, so a dream is something that happens to you, not something you actively do.
That was Augustine's solution. And the consequence of this is huge for ethics. If dreams are just happenings, we can't be held morally responsible for them. Notions of sin or moral blame just don't apply.
Because morality only applies to actions, and according to Augustine, there are no real actions in dreams.
Exactly. That was his fundamental commitment. But our source brings up a pretty significant challenge to this view.
Let me guess. Lucid dreaming.
You got it. Lucid dreaming, where people are aware they're dreaming and can often exert conscious control over what happens. Doesn't that look a lot like genuine action and decision-making?
It really does.
Yeah.
If you can decide to, say, fly somewhere else in the dream, that feels like an action.
It certainly complicates Augustine's neat distinction. The success of his whole argument really hinges on there being no actions in dreams. Lucid dreaming seems to provide pretty strong evidence against that premise.
So the source concludes Augustine's argument doesn't quite hold up because dreams, at least lucid ones, can involve actions.
That seems to be the takeaway, yeah.
Okay, so if we can act in dreams, does that open the door to moral evaluation after all? This is where the source brings in consequentialism and deontology.
Right. Dreaming, in this philosophical context, becomes a specific case of a much broader concern. What about fantasies, thoughts, virtual actions that don't seem to have direct real-world consequences?
Like the debate around violent video games.
Exactly. Is there something inherently unethical about, say, simulating harm in a game, even if it doesn't make you violent in real life? Or, more generally, are we morally obligated not to even entertain certain thoughts?
A tricky area.
And dreaming is maybe a special case because in non-lucid dreams, at least, we typically believe we're performing actions in what feels like real life.
Right. We don't usually know it's just a dream at the time.
So for this discussion, the source asks us to sort of bracket the empirical question for a moment and assume that dream actions have no direct impact on waking behavior.
Okay, got it. So starting with consequentialism, judging actions by their outcomes, how does that apply to dreams?
Well, the core idea of consequentialism is simple. Good actions lead to good outcomes. Bad actions lead to bad outcomes. So if dream actions have no outcomes, no consequences in the real world,
Then they're morally neutral.
that's the straightforward consequentialist line. If it causes no harm, it's not wrong. Some consequentialists might even go further and say there's intrinsic value in the freedom of thought we have in dreams.
Like exploring possibilities without real-world risk.
Exactly. Though, of course, that value couldn't outweigh actual harm to others. So, for example, if lucid dreaming somehow made you a kinder person when awake, a consequentialist would probably say, great, go for it.
Makes sense. And this holds even if the dream is about, say, a specific person I know.
Our source suggests, yes, even if the dream has what philosophers call singular content, it's about a specific individual, like your friend Bob, rather than just a generic person. As long as dreaming about Bob doesn't actually harm the real Bob, the consequentialist wouldn't see an issue.
Okay, so that's consequentialism. What about deontology? That's a very different approach, focused on duties and rules, right?
Completely different. Deontology isn't primarily concerned with outcomes. It's about whether an action or even a thought adheres to certain moral rules or duties.
Regardless of the consequences.
Right. So a deontologist might argue that we have a duty never to even entertain certain thoughts or simulate certain actions because doing so is inherently wrong. It might violate a fundamental duty, like respecting others.
How would that apply to dreaming about someone specific?
Well, deontology stresses that individuals are ends in themselves, not just means to an end. So harming a dream representation of someone you know, even if it doesn't affect the real person, might be seen as violating the duty to treat that person with respect as an end in themselves.
Even in a dream, you're not treating the representation as a means to your own, say, dream entertainment.
That's the potential deontological concern. You're using their image, their representation, in a way that disrespects their inherent worth.
That's a much stricter view than consequentialism.
It generally is.
Yeah.
However, our source notes there might be some nuance. Perhaps both perspectives could agree it's okay to harm generic dream characters who don't represent anyone real.
Okay. But what about the dreamer themselves?
Good point. A deontologist like Kant argued that performing immoral acts, even simulated ones, fails to treat oneself as an end in oneself. It degrades your own rational nature.
So even if no one else is involved, it could still be wrong from a deontological perspective because of what it does to you, the dreamer.
Potentially, yes. And here, the distinction between active fantasy and maybe more passive dreaming, recalling Augustine's action happening idea, might become relevant again. Perhaps the deontological concern applies more strongly to lucid dreams, where there's clear intention and agency.
Right, maybe ordinary non-lucid dreams get a pass because they feel more like things happening to us.
That's a possible interpretation, yeah. It could exempt many dreams from strict deontological judgment.
This is getting really intricate. Okay, finally, the source mentions virtue ethics. How does that shift the conversation?
Virtue ethics takes a different tack altogether. Instead of focusing on rules, deontology, or consequences, consequentialism, of specific actions, it asks, what kind of person should I be? How can I cultivate good character and live a flourishing life?
So the question isn't, is this dream immoral? But maybe. What can I learn from this dream to become a better person?
Exactly. It reframes the whole issue. It's less about policing dream content and more about how dreams might contribute to our overall moral development and well-being.
How might they do that? The source mentions Freud and Jung again here.
Yeah, looking at their ideas through a virtue ethics lens. Both saw dreams as connecting us to our unconscious, revealing hidden motivations, fears, hopes, and habits.
So paying attention to dreams could increase self-awareness.
That's the idea. Studying dreams, reflecting on them, could help us understand ourselves better, face our inner conflicts, maybe even foster creativity. The act of engaging with our dreams becomes a practice that could potentially cultivate virtues like self-knowledge or courage.
So recalling and thinking about dreams could be part of living a good, fulfilled life.
That's the argument presented. Of course, our source adds the caveat that this relies heavily on Freudian or Jungian theories about how dreams function, which are, well, not universally accepted as scientific fact. Dream analysis is often seen as more of an art.
Fair enough. But then, developing character in waking life isn't exactly a hard science either.
That's a good point. Virtue ethics here is almost like the positive flip side of therapy aiming for flourishing, rather than just fixing problems.
The source also mentions an interplay between waking life and dream content in this context.
Right. Dreams often seem to unconsciously pick up on our waking thought patterns and concerns. Interestingly, you can apparently even train yourself to lucid dream by intentionally focusing on certain thoughts during the day.
Which makes you wonder, going back to Augustine.
Exactly. Did he fully grapple with those troubling desires in his waking life? Or were the dreams reflecting something unresolved?
And how does lucid dreaming specifically fit into virtue ethics?
Well, if ordinary dreams often feel passive, lucid dreams introduce clear choice and agency, like waking life. This makes them a really interesting space for ethical consideration. It's especially with the rise of other virtual realities.
So it's like practicing being virtuous in a simulated world.
That's one way to look at it. For virtue ethicists, the focus might shift from the content of any single dream to the activity of dreaming itself, especially lucid dreaming and its place in a well-lived life.
The source mentions Stephen LaBerge, the lucid dreaming researcher.
Yeah, suggesting he might be seen as an implicit virtue ethicist of dreaming. We spend a huge chunk of our lives asleep, and a fair bit of that dreaming. LaBerge argued that by not cultivating lucidity, we miss opportunities to explore our minds, solve problems, and enrich our waking lives.
So the argument is that a virtuous, flourishing person would want to develop these skills to make the most of their mental life even during sleep.
That's the idea. Of course, there's the objection. Shouldn't you spend that time doing tangible good deeds in the real world?
Right, like volunteering instead of practicing lucid dreaming.
A valid point. But the counter-argument might draw parallels to something like meditation.
How so?
Well, meditation might not seem like direct action, but it can cultivate inner states like calmness or focus that help you act more virtuously in difficult situations later. Similarly, lucid dreaming could foster self-understanding, courage, facing dream fears, or wisdom, contributing to long-term character development.
So it could be seen as a supplementary virtue, expanding our agency into the dream world.
Potentially, yes. If human experience is about making choices, lucid dreaming opens up a whole new realm for that.
That's a really different way of thinking about the value of dreams. Okay, let's move on to our third major question. Are dreams consciously experienced?
Ah, yes. This gets to the very heart of what's happening when we sleep. Are we actually having experiences, or is something else going on?
The core debate seems to be whether those vivid dream worlds are truly experienced during sleep, or if maybe they're constructed somehow when we wake up.
Exactly. Our source starts by outlining what it calls the received view of dreaming.
Which we touched on earlier with Descartes. It's basically the common sense idea, right?
Pretty much, it's the largely unquestioned belief that a dream is a sequence of conscious experiences that occur while we're asleep.
And we remember bits that when we wake up.
Right. This view generally holds that dreams unfold roughly in real time. The content we recall is more or less what we experienced. And our reports, I dreamed about X, are decent evidence that the dream actually happened.
So the basic flow is experience during sleep memory waking report.
That's the standard picture. The received view also assumes we don't just invent dream memories wholesale. When we forget things, it's usually omission, not fabrication. And dreams happen during sleep, not just in the split second before waking.
And we could have thoughts, feelings, perceptions within the dream.
Yes, the received view generally assumes we can have mental states like beliefs, judgments, fear, joy, etc. within the dream, similar to waking life. It seems intuitive, supported by countless dream reports.
It does feel like the default way most of us think about dreams. But then came Norman Malcolm.
Indeed. Malcolm mounted a significant philosophical challenge to this whole picture. He argued against pretty much all these implicit claims held by, well, most people.
Okay, so how did he challenge it? The source breaks it down into 3 arguments.
Yes. First, Malcolm argued that dream reports are fundamentally unverifiable.
Unverifiable, meaning we can't prove they actually refer to an experience during sleep.
Exactly. He wasn't just saying be skeptical. He claimed they are logically insufficient to prove conscious dreaming during sleep. Why? Because our memory of a dream recalled after waking is not the dream experience itself.
Right, the memory isn't the event. That makes sense.
And Malcolm argued there's no other way to verify the core claim that conscious experience happens during sleep. The only criterion we actually have, he said, is waking up with the impression of having dreamed and then reporting it.
But the impression doesn't guarantee the experience happened during sleep.
Not for Malcolm. He argued the dream is logically inseparable from the waking report. We can't independently check if the report corresponds to a prior sleep experience.
So trying to use, say, brain scans or eye movements wouldn't count for Malcolm.
He'd argue that brings in behavioral criteria, which at best give probabilities, not certainty. And more fundamentally, he'd say if scientists start defining dreams by brain activity, they've changed the subject. They're not talking about dreams in the original sense, which was tied solely to the waking report.
Wow. So I dreamed I was flying. Doesn't necessarily mean I had a flying experience while asleep, just that I woke up thinking I did.
That's the radical implication of his first argument. It really undermines the foundation of how we talk about dreams.
Okay, what was his second argument?
His second argument accused the received view of being internally contradictory. He claimed the very definitions of sleep and dream conflict, making conscious dreaming during sleep incoherent.
A contradiction. How so?
Malcolm suggested that sleep, fundamentally, implies an absence of conscious experience and responsiveness. But dreaming inherently involves conscious experience.
Ah, so you can't be both unconscious, asleep,
Right.
and conscious dreaming at the same time.
That was Malcolm's point. He saw it as a logical contradiction. Sleep implies no consciousness. Dreaming implies consciousness. Therefore, dreaming during sleep implies both consciousness and no consciousness simultaneously.
And this ties back to the verification problem.
Yes, he felt it corroborated his first argument. Any attempt to verify a dream, example, asking someone questions, would, in his view, just prove they weren't truly deeply asleep.
He had a very strict definition of sleep, it seems.
He did. Deep, unresponsive sleep was his paradigm. Any awareness of the environment meant you weren't fully asleep.
Okay, and the third argument.
The third argument focused on the alleged impossibility of communicating or making judgments during sleep.
Why is that important?
Malcolm saw communicability as crucial for a mental state to be considered a verifiable experience, drawing on Wittgenstein. He argued that since you can't meaningfully communicate or make judgments while truly asleep, dreams can't be verifiable conscious experiences.
How did he argue against communication during sleep?
His classic example: you can't truthfully say, "I am asleep," and be aware of saying it. If you're aware, you're not asleep. If you're asleep, you're not aware you're saying it. He extended this to say any meaningful communication is impossible during sleep.
So no judgments, no communication means no verifiable conscious states like dreams.
That was his conclusion. He argued you can't even judge that you are asleep without demonstrating you're actually awake. Therefore, the whole idea of having complex thoughts, beliefs, and experiences during sleep is fundamentally incoherent.
That's a thorough dismantling of the received view. And he thought this weakened skepticism.
Ironically, yes. Because Descartes' skepticism relied on the similarity between dream experiences and waking experiences. If dreams aren't actually conscious experiences in the same way, Malcolm argued, then the comparison breaks down. You can't be deceived by a dream if you're not having a conscious experience during it.
So for Malcolm, being aware of anything is proof you're awake and not being deceived by a dream.
Exactly. It's a fascinating, if highly counterintuitive position.
Absolutely. But surely people push back against Malcolm.
Oh, definitely. Our source highlights several important objections. One came from Hilary Putnam, focusing on Malcolm's view of science and concepts.
Right. Malcolm thought scientists studying brain activity during sleep weren't studying dreams anymore.
Exactly. Putnam strongly disagreed. He argued that science constantly updates and refines our concepts based on new discoveries. It doesn't just invent new ones entirely unrelated to the old ones.
Like with understanding a disease better, we don't say it's a completely different disease just because we learn more about its cause.
That's Putnam's analogy, using multiple sclerosis. Just because our diagnostic tools or understanding of MS evolve, we're still talking about MS. Similarly, finding new ways to measure or verify dreaming, like REM sleep, doesn't mean we're suddenly talking about something other than the phenomenon people have always called dreaming. We're just understanding it better.
So Putnam defended the idea that empirical research is relevant to the traditional concept of dreaming.
Yes, he argued against Malcolm's attempt to logically wall off dreaming from scientific investigation.
Okay, what other objections were there?
Another very influential one uses David Rosenthal's distinction between state consciousness and creature consciousness.
Ah, right. Remind us what that distinction is.
Okay, so creature consciousness is basically being awake and responsive to the external world, like an awake person or animal. State consciousness refers to having an internal mental experience, like a thought, a feeling, or a perception, regardless of whether you're responsive externally.
And how does this challenge Malcolm?
Well, Malcolm seemed to assume that you need creature consciousness, being awake or responsive, to have state consciousness, internal experience.
But Rosenthal's distinction suggests maybe you don't.
Exactly. The Rosenthalian argument is, why can't you be creature unconscious, unresponsive externally, i.e. asleep, but still state conscious, having internal experiences, i.e. dreaming?
So sleep only means lacking outward responsiveness, not necessarily lacking inner awareness.
Precisely. If that distinction holds, then Malcolm's core contradiction that sleep, no consciousness, and dreaming, consciousness, can't coexist dissolves. You can be asleep, creature unconscious, and dreaming, state conscious, at the same time without any logical problem.
That seems to fit our intuitive experience much better.
It does. And it allows for things like dream content incorporating external sounds, like thunder, without requiring the person to be awake, in Malcolm's sense. They can be state conscious, dreaming about Thor's hammer, while remaining creature unconscious, asleep.
That distinction really seems to undermine Malcolm's arguments significantly. Now, our source moves on to another major challenge to the received view, from Daniel Dennett.
Right. Dennett also questions the received view, but from a different angle than Malcolm. He proposes a completely new model.
Not just critiquing, but offering an alternative. What's his model?
He calls it the unconscious content uploading model. The core radical idea is that consciousness is entirely absent during sleep when dreams are supposedly happening.
Wow, so even more radical than Malcolm in some ways. No consciousness at all during the dream process.
That's Dennett's proposal. He suggests that during sleep, various unconscious processes are at work, accessing memories, weaving them together, constructing narratives. But this is all happening below the level of conscious awareness.
So where does the experience of the dream come from?
According to Dennett, the conscious experience only happens upon waking. The brain essentially uploads this pre-prepared, unconsciously generated content into our awareness as we wake up, creating the memory of having had a dream experience.
So the dream recall is the first time the content becomes conscious. We're remembering something that never actually happened consciously.
That's the mind-bending implication. It's like the brain records a movie overnight without anyone watching and then plays it back for us as a memory when we wake up.
What's his evidence for this? He mentions the REM sleep correlation too, right?
He does, like the finding that eye movements might match reported dream content, for example, watching tennis. But Dennett argues this doesn't prove conscious experience during sleep. The unconscious processes preparing the dream narrative could be directing the eye movements automatically as part of the recording process.
So the eyes might move, the body might twitch during a nightmare scenario being prepared, but there's no conscious viewer inside experiencing it at that moment.
That's Dennett's interpretation. He argues it's perfectly plausible from an evolutionary perspective, too. Maybe the brain needs purely unconscious time to sort things out. The body acts out bits of the script being written, but the theater is empty until the moment of waking recall.
He thinks dream report data alone can't distinguish his model from the received view.
Right. He argues both models can account for basic dream recall. That's why he turns to a specific type of dream report he thinks does favor his model.
Which are
Those precognitive dreams, as he somewhat provocatively calls them. The anecdotes where the dream's ending seems perfectly timed with, and maybe even caused by, the stimulus that wakes the person up.
like Mari dreaming of the guillotine as the headboard falls, or the alarm clock sounding just as the dream reaches a crescendo involving bells or sirens.
Exactly. Dennett argues these are a real problem for the received view. If dreams are conscious experiences happening sequentially during sleep, how could the final moments be so perfectly tailored to a future, unpredictable waking event? It would require some kind of backwards causation or, well, actual precognition.
Which seems unlikely.
Right. Dennett argues his model handles these much better. He suggests that upon waking, especially a sudden waking, the brain rapidly confabulates a narrative, a retrospective hallucination that logically leads up to and incorporates the waking stimulus.
So the goat dream, ending with bleeding when the alarm rings, wasn't an experience during sleep, but a story constructed at the moment the alarm rang to make sense of the sound.
That's Dennett's explanation. The brain grabs relevant snippets from unconscious processing or memory stores and weaves them into a plausible narrative culminating in the waking event. It's like having a library of potential dream scenes, and the brain pulls out the right one just as you wake up.
So for Dennett, dreaming is not like anything, although it is like having dreamed. The experience happens only in the recall.
Precisely. It's a powerful challenge. But of course, there are objections to Dennett, too.
Let's hear them. Lucid dreaming must come up again here.
Absolutely. The very existence of lucid dreaming, being aware you're dreaming while dreaming, seems like a direct refutation of Dennett's claim that consciousness is absent during sleep.
Right. If I know I'm dreaming, how can I not be conscious?
That's the obvious objection. Dennett's initial response was basically to deny that lucid dreaming, as reported, actually involves real-time awareness during sleep. He suggested it could just be part of the dream content, dreaming about being lucid, or part of the confabulation upon waking.
So just another trick of the memory.
That was his argument. He doubted it could be experimentally verified. But then came Stephen LaBerge's experiments.
The ones with the eye signals.
Exactly. LaBerge trained lucid dreamers to make specific prearranged eye movements, like left, right, while lucid to signal to the researchers from within the dream.
And they could do it reliably.
Yes. The recorded eye movements matched the agreed-upon signals and the participants' later reports of when they became lucid and performed the signals. They could essentially communicate, albeit simply, from the dream state.
That seems incredibly difficult for Dennett's model to explain. How could unconscious processes execute prearranged voluntary signals at the correct time, corresponding to a reported feeling of lucidity?
It's a very strong challenge. LaBerge's results suggest not only consciousness during sleep, at least in lucid dreams, but also volition and communication. It makes it hard to maintain that it's all just unconscious processing or retrospective confabulation.
It really seems to support the received view, or at least a version of it where consciousness is possible during sleep.
Yeah.
Did Dennett have a response to LaBerge?
The source mentions a potential Denetian counter-objection, though it sounds a bit strained. The idea would be that the unconscious is so sophisticated, it could take over the task of making the prearranged eye movements, having recorded the memory of the agreement with Laberge.
So the unconscious becomes this super intelligent agent mimicking consciousness.
It pushes the boundaries of what we normally think the unconscious can do. Laberge did further experiments, like having lucid dreamers count seconds in their dreams and signal. Finding dream time runs roughly parallel to real time. This seems to require agency that's hard to attribute solely to unconscious processing.
Okay, so lucid dreaming is a major hurdle for Dennett. But what about his precognitive dream anecdotes? Do those still pose a problem for the received view?
That's the other main line of objection to Dennett offering alternative explanations for those anecdotes. The received view doesn't necessarily have to resort to actual precognition.
How else could you explain them? Like Marie and the headboard.
Well, perhaps Maury had some low-level unconscious awareness that the headboard was loose before it fell. Maybe his own movements in the dream, resisting the guillotine, finally knocked it over. The brain, even while mostly asleep, might incorporate subtle environmental cues or bodily states into the dream narrative.
So the falling headboard wasn't a random future event, but something subtly anticipated or even triggered by the dreamer.
That's one possibility. Similarly, for alarm clock dreams, our internal biological clocks are pretty good. We often anticipate waking up around a certain time. Maybe the dream incorporates that anticipation symbolically. Dennett himself set his alarm in his goat anecdote.
So the dream wasn't predicting the alarm, but reflecting the body's or mind's anticipation of the alarm.
Exactly. The argument is that these bland anecdotes involving predictable or internally generated events can potentially be explained by the received view without invoking precognition or Dennett's radical retroselection.
What about truly unpredictable external events? Like a sudden loud noise outside waking someone up with a perfectly themed dream.
Those are what the source calls concrete anecdotes. If those were found to be common through rigorous experiments, they would be a much stronger challenge to the received view. But Dennett's main examples are arguably the bland kind, involving internal states or preset alarms.
And there's also the reporting bias issue, right?
Okay.
With seemingly prophetic dreams in general.
Yes. People have countless dreams. Coincidences are bound to happen. We remember the surprising hits, dreaming of a plane crash before 9/11, and forget the thousands of mundane or incorrect dreams. The sheer number of dreams globally each night makes occasional overlaps with reality statistically likely.
So while Dennett's anecdotes are intriguing, they might not be the fatal blow to the received view that he thought, especially when combined with the evidence from lucid dreaming.
That seems to be the assessment. More empirical work is needed, but the received view, perhaps modified to account for occasional memory distortions, still seems viable.
Okay, this brings us to our final major question from Flanagan's list. Does dreaming have an evolutionary function? Why do we do it?
Right. Shifting to the philosophy of biology, why would natural selection favor this bizarre nightly activity? If a trait persists, especially one as complex and time-consuming as dreaming, adaptationist thinking suggests it probably served some purpose.
But what purpose? Our source mentions the early theories of Freud and Jung first.
Yes. Freud, coming from his psychoanalytic perspective, saw dreams as having a crucial function, primarily wish fulfillment.
The safety valve idea again.
Exactly. He believed we have all these primal, often unacceptable desires bubbling up from the id. Dreams allow these wishes to be satisfied symbolically, in disguise. The manifest content hiding the latent content, preventing us from acting them out dangerously in waking life. This preserves psychological and social stability.
And it also helps keep us asleep, right? By dealing with these urges internally.
That was Freud's other key point. The disguised fulfillment prevents the raw desires from becoming too disturbing and waking us up. So dreaming protects sleep and fulfills wishes, both contributing to survival and well-being from his perspective.
How did Jung's view differ? He also thought dreams were important, but not necessarily about wish fulfillment.
Right. Jung saw dreams less as disguising repressed wishes and more as a way the psyche attempts to achieve balance and wholeness. He emphasized compensation dreams, bringing up aspects of ourselves that are neglected or underdeveloped in waking life.
Like a very logical person having emotional dreams.
Exactly. Or dreams connecting us to the collective unconscious, those shared universal symbols or archetypes inherited from our ancestors. For Jung, dreams help integrate different parts of the psyche, connect us to our deeper history, and even point towards future possibilities for growth and individuation.
So more about psychological development and integration than just managing primal urges.
That's a key difference. Jung saw dreams as inherently meaningful and purposeful communications from the unconscious, not just censored wish fulfillments. Though, as the source notes, translating Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious into standard Darwinian evolutionary terms can be challenging.
Right, the Lamarckian issue again. Okay, so those are the classic psychoanalytic views. What about more contemporary scientific or philosophical approaches to dream function?
Our source outlines two main camps today: pluralism and adaptationism. Owen Flanagan, whom we mentioned earlier, represents a prominent pluralist view.
Pluralism meaning dreaming doesn't necessarily have one single function, or maybe none at all.
Precisely. Flanagan argues compellingly that dreaming might have no specific evolved function. He sees it as an evolutionary byproduct, or spandrel.
A spandrel, like the architectural feature.
Exactly. Spandrels in architecture are the triangular spaces inevitably created when you put arches together to support a dome. They weren't designed for a purpose, they just emerge as a necessary consequence of the main structure. Flanagan suggests dreaming is like that, an unavoidable side effect of having complex cognition and needing to sleep.
So it's just our brains continuing to think, but in a weird offline mode during sleep without any specific adaptive benefit. Mental noise.
That's the core idea of the spandrel theory. As long as this noise doesn't actively harm our fitness, it can just persist as a byproduct. Flanagan points to the often bizarre, disorganized nature of dreams as evidence against a specific function, arguing that attempts to find one often rely on speculative, just-so stories.
Okay, that's a strong argument for dreaming being functionless. Who argues against that?
Revonsuo is a major proponent of the adaptationist view that dreaming does have a specific evolved function. He champions the threat simulation theory, TST.
Threat simulation. So dreams are for practicing dealing with danger.
That's the central claim. Revonsuo argues that the content of dreams is not random noise, but is specifically biased towards simulating threatening events, being chased, attacked, falling, failing.
Why would that be adaptive?
Because, according to TST, repeatedly rehearsing the perception of threats and the appropriate avoidance or escape responses in the safe environment of sleep enhances our ability to survive similar threats in working life. It hones our danger spotting and reaction skills.
Like a built-in virtual reality simulator for survival training.
Exactly. Revonsuo points to evidence like the prevalence of negative emotions, fear, anxiety, anger in dreams, the activation of brain areas like the amygdala involved in fear responses, and the fact that real-life trauma often leads to recurring threatening dreams, like in PTSD.
That makes intuitive sense. But are many dreams not threatening, or just plain weird?
Revonsuo addresses this. He suggests the system might have been most crucial during our evolutionary past, the Pleistocene era, when physical threats were more constant. Our modern, safer environment might mean the system isn't activated as intensely or realistically now. Dreams might be like our appendix, once useful, now somewhat vestigial or repurposed.
So the core function was threat rehearsal, even if modern dreams seem less focused on that.
That's the argument. He also emphasizes that experiencing threats in waking life feeds back into the system, making dreams more focused on simulating those specific dangers. It's a dynamic process.
TST is definitely a compelling alternative to the spandrel theory, but are there criticisms of it?
One criticism mentioned is, if dreaming enhances survival behaviors, why doesn't it also seem to focus on enhancing reproductive behaviors? Finding mates is just as crucial for passing on genes as avoiding threats. Yet explicitly sexual dreams are relatively infrequent.
Good point. Why practice fighting but not flirting?
Revonsuo might counter that survival has to come first, or that the neural systems for threat, sympathetic, and sex, parasympathetic, are so different that mixing them heavily in dreams might be disruptive to sleep. But it remains an interesting question for the theory.
So we have these competing views. Dreams as wish fulfillment, as psychological balancing, as functionless byproducts, or as vital threat simulators. Quite a range.
It really shows how much mystery still surrounds this fundamental aspect of our lives.
Okay, now for our final section, looking at how dreaming fits into contemporary philosophy of mind and consciousness research.
Right, moving beyond function to its role in understanding consciousness itself.
Our source raises two key questions here. First, should dreaming be used as a scientific model for studying consciousness?
Yeah, this is interesting. Scientists often use model systems like fruit flies in genetics or visual perception in consciousness studies because they offer practical advantages or highlight the phenomenon in a particularly clear way.
So the question is, does dreaming have those qualities? Is it a good model system for consciousness?
Revonsuo argues strongly that it is, or at least should be. He thinks the dreaming brain offers a unique window into consciousness.
Why unique?
Primarily because dreaming consciousness occurs largely isolated from external sensory input and ongoing behavioral output. It's consciousness running purely on internal resources.
So it's like studying consciousness in its pure, internally generated form.
That's Revonsuo's argument. He calls it a rare example of pure consciousness. The content changes rapidly, it's immersive, we usually think it's real, and it happens without the constant stream of data from our eyes and ears or the need to control our bodies in the same way as when awake.
So, by studying the dreaming brain, we might isolate the core mechanisms needed for subjective experience itself.
That's the hope. If we see what brain activity is necessary for dream phenomenology, we can perhaps subtract what's not needed, getting closer to the neural basis of consciousness. It highlights the subjective world-for-me nature of experience.
That sounds like a powerful argument for using dreaming as a model. But are there downsides or counter-arguments?
Yes, Wint and Nareka, mentioned in our source, raise some important cautions. Firstly, unlike a fruit fly, there isn't universal agreement on what dreaming even is. Different theories characterize it very differently.
Right. Using it as a model depends heavily on which description of dreaming you accept.
Exactly. Revonsuo's model relies on dreams being quite organized and realistic replicas of waking consciousness, but Wint and Nareka argue that dreams often differ significantly in structure and content from waking life.
So maybe it's not a perfect replica.
Maybe not. They suggest that instead of being a primary model system, dreaming might be more valuable as a contrast system.
Contrast, meaning comparing dreaming to waking consciousness to highlight the differences.
Precisely. By studying how consciousness operates differently across these two states, what changes in terms of self-awareness, logical reasoning, sensory experience, volitional control, we might learn more about the necessary conditions for different types of conscious experience.
That also makes a lot of sense. Studying the differences can be just as revealing as studying the similarities.
It's a different but potentially very fruitful way to leverage dreaming in consciousness research.
Now, the source also brings up that second contemporary question. Is dreaming fundamentally more like hallucination or imagination? But it flags this as potentially too big for today's dive.
Yeah, that's a whole other deep topic. Are the things we see and hear in dreams more like faulty perceptions of a non-existent world, hallucinations? Or are they more like internally generated mental constructs, like when we deliberately imagine something, imagination?
It gets to the nitty-gritty of what constitutes perception versus imagination and where dreaming fits on that spectrum. Definitely something for another time, perhaps.
Agreed. It's a rich area.
Well, that brings us towards the end of our deep dive into the philosophy of dreams for today. We've certainly covered a lot of ground.
We really have, from Descartes' doubt
to Augustine's worries about sinning in his sleep.
The challenges from Malcolm and Dennett about whether we're even conscious.
And then the fascinating evolutionary theories, Freud, Jung, spandrels, threat simulation.
And finally, touching on how dreaming is viewed in modern consciousness science.
There were definitely some surprising facts and moments for me. The whole idea that you might actually feel pain in dreams, that really stuck with me.
Yeah, and the stark contrast between Freud seeing dreams as wish fulfillment versus Jung seeing them as compensatory or guiding.
Or the idea that dreams could just be evolutionary noise, Flanagan standrels, versus Revonsuo's idea that they're this vital training ground. Very different pictures.
And the lucid dreaming evidence challenging Dennett's unconscious uploading model is just fascinating. The implications are huge.
It really highlights, doesn't it, the complexity and the ongoing nature of these philosophical debates. No easy answers here.
Not at all. We're probing the very nature of our own minds and experiences.
And for you, our learner, we really hope this deep dive has been a helpful shortcut, a way to get to the core of these fascinating questions.
Yeah, introducing multiple perspectives without, hopefully, leaving you feeling too overwhelmed by all the different theories.
So as you consider all these different takes on dreaming, from mere mental noise to vital evolutionary rehearsal, what seems most compelling to you now about the nature and purpose of your own dream life?
Is it a source of hidden desires, maybe a playground for the mind, a training simulator, or perhaps something else entirely?
Definitely something to ponder as you drift off tonight. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.